I am one of the founders of Fractal, and Fractal is a content marketing and digital PR agency. So we take a data journalism based approach to creating content on behalf of our clients. And then about half our team is dedicated to taking the data driven content that we produce and pitching it to mainstream publishers to try and attract and earn press attention that then typically results in a lot of downstream syndications and high domain authority links being built. And that's kind of the methodology that we're known for, and it's a methodology that I think is growing in popularity in the industry. So last time I talked a bit about our work and the sorts of results you can kind of expect from doing this type of work. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about data journalism as it can be applied to content marketing and digital PR, and some of the things that really that kind of have emerged in the last 5 years or so that can make this process a lot easier and have really made it so that anybody can do data journalism style content that will enable you to create new and newsworthy pieces of content that can actually earn press. So with that, I'll get started. So I just wanted to start with some like axioms of this webinar, because I'm not going to be going into depth on these, and hopefully you just sort of generally agree with them. The first is that generating press for your brand is a worthwhile endeavor for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it can significantly boost brand visibility. And then the reason most people come to Fractal is because they care a lot about scalably building high domain authority links, which over time have the effect of often vastly improving organic search rankings. And then lastly, which is really what this whole thing is about, is that data-driven stories and investigative brand journalism are one of, if not the best vehicle for garnering press in my opinion. So based on that, I have a thesis here, which is brands are now well positioned to help prevent the death of in-depth journalism while reaping huge rewards for doing so. They'll do this by leveraging data journalism and investigative reporting through the democratization of open data and open data analysis tools, supported by a new era of digital PR professionals and open-minded or sometimes desperate publishers. And I want to just start with like this higher level kind of my understanding of the direction of where journalism is going, because I think it's a really important point for content marketers to understand that there is this erosion of in-depth journalism happening, and an erosion of the numbers of people who are doing this type of work. And it's really a huge opportunity for brands to kind of fill in some of those gaps and help play a role in the future of journalism by doing really good brand journalism that publishers then will kind of take on as their own. So looking a little bit at why this is, the first really has to do with the changing distribution and consumption channels that have resulted in destroying publisher revenues. So these are, you guys have probably seen charts like this. These are newspaper advertising revenues over the last 35 years or so. And this chart, if you extended it to 2019, would look even kind of more dismal. But the reality is that the newspapers are no longer bringing in the revenues that they used to. And this decline in revenues has really decimated journalism jobs, especially in-depth reporting and local news. And the reason for that is because in-depth reporting is much more expensive to do. There are fewer stories created. So you might have somebody who's doing an investigative piece or deep data journalism piece that would take weeks to months to create versus something that they're churning out in a day or a few days. And local news has also similarly been hollowed out. So instead of having actual true local news stories, you just get a lot of like syndicated stories from major publishers or rehashes of Associated Press stories or things like that. So the number of newsroom employees has also declined drastically. And you see this mostly in newspaper publishing, but it's also happening in digital as well. So as these jobs sort of disappear, so do this, the great in-depth data journalism type stories that come with them. And then even sadder, as revenue channels change, publications have really started to chase clicks, and this has been really the reason for the rise of clickbait. So even the New York Times isn't really immune to this. This was an analysis that was done on clickbait headlines, and you can see like sort of around the time when BuzzFeed really proved the model that clickbait works super well, and the rise of channels sort of moving to social and rather than what previously would have been owned channels. You see even reputable news organizations like the New York Times engaging in more clickbait style headlines, which has kind of been a sad trend. And then as news publishers lose revenues, journalists shift jobs towards lower quality content creation. So instead of really hiring new great journalists, you see these people moving into content positions and social media positions. And for the most part, I don't think our industry has done a great job of encouraging high quality content creation or in-depth quality content creation. Instead, we see more of this massive influx of low quality content and social based content and clickbait based content. And the total end result of this is that clickbait and low quality journalism has eroded the trust of readers significantly. So this was a Gallup poll that showed this decline over the last 40 or 50 years. So mainstream news publishers and their readers, they really deeply need in-depth journalism, but the problem is many publishers no longer have the money to do it themselves. So this is where the opportunity lies for brands. And the question really is, who will pay for the future of in-depth journalism? Digital subscriptions, maybe for a handful of publishers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, maybe a few others will survive this way just based on the history of their brand and the number of readers they already have. But it doesn't seem like this will be a sustainable model for most publications. Government subsidies, so like Andrew Yang, for instance, is advocating for journalism subsidies to help to restore what we previously had under different business models, where more money could be spent on stories that can't be directly tied to generating clicks and generating huge numbers of views to sell advertising. A return to print journalism, that's not happening. I think part of the real answer here is that brand and citizen journalism will help fill in these gaps. And the reasons I think that brands are better positioned to do in-depth journalism, I have here as bullet points. So brand visibility, link equity, social sharing, and SEO drive the value here. And that's value that couldn't be obtained by the publications for themselves. They can only really earn money through subscriptions or through ads. But for brands, those links are worth quite a bit. On a per article basis, many brands can spend between $5,000 and $50,000 per piece and still have ultimately a high ROI if those pieces are successfully promoted in the press and generate the numbers and volumes of high domain authority links that they need. And the resulting ranking increases justify the spend on that more expensive, more in-depth content. And Fractal's business model among probably 10 to 20 other agencies have proven this. The truth is that brands have the money, time, and resources to replace the loss of this in-depth journalism done by the mainstream publishers, and digital PR can provide the bridge between publishers and brand journalists. So instead of an internal newsroom producing these stories, you have, I think in the future, we will have more and more writers at these publications looking externally for stories that are coming directly from PR professionals who are pitching data journalism style content to those writers and editors at those publications. And then just briefly, the recipe, or Fractal's understanding and my understanding of the recipe for brand journalism success. So it has to make sense for your brand, should be thematically or topically tied to the product or service that you're offering. This is important for a lot of reasons. First, so that the people that you're pitching, don't call into question the reason why you produce this content. And then second, it's important to have topically and thematically relevant anchor text and copy in the stories that the journalists write, linking back to your landing page that holds the full story. It needs to be new and newsworthy content, which is why it generally has to be data-driven. Rehashing existing content usually fails. It's not something publishers will pick up. And it has to provide significant value to the reader, either utility, entertainment, or provide some explanatory value. And it should be broadly interesting to a target audience and to the target publisher's audience. And keeping those two things in mind, especially the target publisher's audience, is really important. So for brands that do in-depth journalism, things are getting a lot easier. And this is really what the meat of this talk is about. This was a project I did. It's on Moz. It was a project that scraped news stories that contained in the title or in the text the words study finds. So I was using that keyword as kind of a proxy for understanding which publishers pick up stories that were based on externally done studies. And those studies could have been by academic institutions, they could have been done by brands, they could have been done by individuals. But these couple of visualizations kind of show the distribution across a bunch of different domains, publisher domains, and the numbers of stories that they wrote over the last year or so based on study finds. There are other keyword searches that I could have done to show even more than this, but really what it's showing is that there's a really strong appetite, especially among some domains in particular, some publishers in particular, that really want these data-driven projects from external sources. And I would actually like in the next year or two to kind of refresh this project and see how it's changed, because I think what we'll see over the next couple of years is a stronger and stronger appetite for these data-driven type stories. So in the last 5 years, we've been given, in my opinion, at least 5 superpowers to help us out. And the rest of this talk is about those 5 superpowers. So the first superpower is the growth of open data. And I found this graphic and I thought it was really interesting. You guys can take a look at it and I think get quite a bit out of it. But really it's kind of a flow chart of the benefits of what data journalism can provide. And ultimately, these are the things that we're looking for when we're coming up with ideas to do data journalism. Increase citizen engagement, improve quality of life, improve trust in government, and economic growth. So in the big data universe, you have kind of 2 sections, and this is a really good representation of how Fractal thinks about acquiring data sets. So you have private sector information, public sector information, and then open data, which overlaps both. And these are the 2 primary sources where you can get data to create data-driven content projects, open government data and open private data. So actually, in my research for this deck, I found this site. It's called figshare.com, and it's really an amazing resource. It's a shared repository for academics who want to make the data that they used in their academic papers available for free in an open source way to everybody. So there are literally thousands of interesting data sets, like on any topic you could ever imagine, that probably have not been used by anybody but the researcher. This visualization is just the growth on that particular site and a couple of other similar competitor sites. But it shows the massive hockey stick style growth of these open academic data sets, which is kind of a really new entry into open data that I think no one's really utilizing yet, but could really be an amazing place for you to get ideas and then to find data that you could use as the basis for data-driven projects that you're creating. Similarly, Kaggle has a huge open data set source, and this is a chart that's graphing the growth of downloads of those open data sets. So here again, you see like a hockey stick style growth where you have a ton of people who are now leveraging open data in new ways. Not all of them are doing it for journalistic purposes. Some are doing it for machine learning and other types of business intelligence goals, but it's really changing fast, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. So at Fractal, this is a distribution of the types of projects that we do. So surveys are more than half. Really, that's, I think, owed to the extensibility of surveys and that you can ask really any question you want and develop a data set on that. So I think ideas just come more easily when you're coming up with survey ideas than if you're starting with a data set and coming up with ideas based on that data set, or you're coming up with an idea and then trying to find a data set that fits with it. For surveys, we generally use Amazon's Mechanical Turk. We sometimes use other paid services, and we sometimes use Facebook ads to recruit survey participants. And then the other two groups are the private data sets and the government data sets. So this is a distribution of the government data sets that Fractal's used over the past 2 to 3 years. So this big block here is really like one-off ones, so just random data sets that we used once or twice. The second one is a fatal accident reporting system, which is the government's huge data repository of all traffic deaths that have happened. We've done 30 projects. Part of that has to do with the mix of clients that we have. We have quite a few in the auto and car insurance space, but it also has a lot to do with the robustness of that data set and how many amazing, unique little tidbits you can find in there to do projects on really anything related to traffic and or car safety. The CDC, this is a grouped one, so the CDC has many available data sets, but there are quite a few that we've used related to public health. The US Census is a huge one. The Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, the Uniform Crime Report. You guys can look at this later, but this is sort of a ranked list for us in terms of which government data sets have sort of the most meat on the bones for doing content projects. And then these are examples of public data sets that we use. So again, there's like this huge segment of these one-offs that I didn't list individually, but I can actually put together a full like Excel file or Google sheet that has every data set that we've ever used. But it's just still scratching the surface of what's actually available out there. So some of these also included data scrapes of public places like Instagram and Twitter, and things like client data. So just a couple examples of projects that we've done using public data sets. This is a project called Nursing Homes in America, and the source was a nursing home comparison site where we just scraped the data and then built data visualizations, looking at the ratings of different nursing homes and a bunch of different data views related to that. Another one, so we've done this a few times, actually, calculators can be a great source of data. There are thousands of unique calculators online, and you just put data in and you get data out, and then you can use those as part of your data set. So for this one, we did some calculations on the cost of raising children, breaking it down by different variables and then also different locations on the full project. But this was all done using MIT's wage calculator. And then a few examples of the government data. So we did a project looking at the most stolen cars by the numbers, and this was just using the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, which is like a queryable data set or database that can pull out a ton of information, including things like car theft. And although this data is available, it hasn't really been written about because the data hasn't been accessed and then visualized in interesting ways. And that's really where brands and agencies can come in and provide that value of just taking things that are not transparent to the public but are freely available and turning them into visual assets that make them easy to consume and make them newsworthy. Another example, looking at the healthcare for people over age 55, and this used the CDC's behavioral risk factor surveillance system. Lots of different data views. I think this project had 7 or 8 individual assets on it, and I think each of these are linked, so when we show the deck you can actually check out all the projects. But it really ended up being a pretty simple way to generate good press using authoritative data and freely available data. And then of course surveys. So like you saw in one of the previous charts, we do a ton of these. I mean, we've done hundreds of them now at this point. This was looking at subscription mooching. So we just asked people about their behaviors regarding whether or not they share their Netflix accounts or their Hulu accounts or whatever else. And then we did demographic breakdowns. So demographic breakdowns have been kind of a staple for a lot of the projects that we do, revolving surveys. People are interested in how they individually stack up versus their peers or versus other types of demographic segmentations. Another one, I'll skip through those ones. So superpower 2, powerful and easy to use web scrapers. So at Fractal, a lot of our creatives know how to do web scraping, know enough Python to be able to do it, but we also have some dedicated developers who help us do some of the more complex scraping jobs. Like for instance, a project we did recently on police data was a fairly advanced scrape because oftentimes like public court records data sets try and restrict how much data you can actually scrape from them. So you have to kind of do some crazy things, but there are a ton of tools out there that simplify this process and make it a lot easier for anybody to do even relatively complex scraping. So this, I found this and I thought this was a really useful chart. These are most of the frameworks available out there for doing web scraping. And in our experience, we've used Mechanical Soup, Scrapey, and Puppeteer the most. They're sort of our favorites here, and they're a really good place to start if you're thinking about starting to do projects that involve web scraping. So this is an example of a web scrape project that we did called Spring Break Intoxicated, where we scraped Instagram for different hashtags mentioning different types of intoxication. Really simple project to execute. The data acquisition was very easy. There are a number of different ways to scrape Instagram. And then basically from there, it was just data analysis and creating these data visualizations. Another type of scrape that we do frequently are news story scrapes, where we can look at a lot of different pieces of information around specific types of news stories, either by entity or by topic or category or subcategory. And then all the associated metadata with those things, like the sentiment of those as well. And we often combine web scraped data with other sources to supplement that data. So for instance, taking scraped news stories and passing them through a sentiment analyzer to get their sentiment. Superpower 3, the democratization of data analysis and visualization tools. And this really is maybe the biggest one, and really the reason we've been able to internally scale data-driven content creation at Fractal. And I would give a lot of the credit to Tableau individually. Tableau and Power BI are probably the two most popular like data mixing and visualization tools. But Tableau, in my opinion, is one of the easiest to learn, and knowing just a little bit can make you extremely powerful. And it's also one of the best supported. So there are tons of tutorials online for learning, and lots of great examples that you can just download and see how it's done. So as you can see here, I mean, these tools have increased in popularity significantly over the last 5 years, and I think they'll continue to. And for brands that are looking to do data journalism or brand data journalism, I think Tableau is maybe the most important thing you could teach your content creators. Another super important thing for us has been the rise of open source code. So GitHub in particular has, I mean, just absolutely massive amounts, like 3-4 million open source repositories to do almost anything you could think of. If you're trying to do something that you think you need to write a Python program for, it probably already exists on GitHub. So the rise of these open source libraries have really simplified a lot of the complexities of data acquisition, data cleaning, and data analysis. Superpower 4 is the availability of APIs. So this is a chart that shows the growth of APIs, and we use APIs very frequently for either getting data or supplementing our data to make it more robust or to give new angles of investigation. And this link in particular is one that I found researching for this deck, and it's the largest repository of public APIs that I've found. And I think it's a really great resource, and I wanted to give it its own slide. So one example of a project that was done purely with an API, IBM Watson has a number of different APIs, but Google also has a ton of APIs that can let you really get different pieces of information and often access the outputs from some pretty advanced artificial intelligence systems. So this is an API that's based on Watson's personality analysis tool, which is an AI model. But basically all we did was we took scraped text from different tech leaders and fed it into the personality API, got the results out, and then did some data visualizations around the results. And then Superpower 5, artificial intelligence and open source models. So if you guys are members of this community, you've probably seen me like almost spamming the community with the AI experiments that I'm doing on like a weekly basis now. And it's really simply just because I find them so interesting and because so many cool things are coming out so frequently now. You can really feel the acceleration of these open source libraries and the cool things that can be done with them just becoming more and more democratized. So this is a growth of AI papers. So another hockey stick style growth curve here. Total number of papers being released each year in China, Europe, and the USA. So it's just a massive amount of work that's being done collaboratively by AI researchers across the world. And then this is probably my favorite site on the internet, paperswithcode.com. Basically, it's a curated list of AI papers that also have associated open source code. And for many or even most of these, it's relatively simple even for beginners of Python to implement some of these AI models and use them on their own data and create really cool things with them. And then the rise of Google Colab, which is really just a tool that Google put out that makes it really simple to do your own AI development on their own tool and gives you free access to GPU and TPU resources. So this has really, I think, been a big thing as well. And the growth of Jupyter Notebook, which I think has made it a lot easier for people to learn to program Python, and then to also democratize the sharing of code that's easy to understand and easy to tweak, and has kind of saved my life as I've learned Python and I've investigated some of these open source libraries. So a few examples of AI-driven projects that we've done. You guys probably have seen this, where we used an AI text generation model from Salesforce called Control to generate text in the style of Donald Trump. And then we combined that with surveys to figure out who could tell the difference between real Trump speeches and AI written speeches that were trained on Trump speeches. And this ended up doing really, really well, just because it's a hot topic and it was kind of a new exploration, but it was really pretty easy to implement. Something that I think really actually could be done now by people that actually have no programming knowledge. Another example, Imagine Celebrity Children. So this was using an AI model called StyleGAN. Again, basically just found the code on GitHub, copied it, tweaked it a little bit, put in my own images, and came out with these. And it ended up being another cool project that hasn't been promoted, but I think it will probably do pretty well. And then we have one of our campaign managers. I didn't create this one, but I helped her with it for a client. This hasn't been released yet, but basically we used the language generation, several language generation models to ask the AI a bunch of existential questions. So like, what's the goal of humanity? What's the biggest problem facing humanity? Is there life in the universe? A bunch of other ones. And then we compared those using a survey to the answers to those same questions by like prominent thought leaders like Elon Musk or from the Bible, or Stephen Hawking or Pope Francis, whatever. And the funny thing was, actually a lot of the AI existential answers won in our survey for being the best answer. So just another interesting example of how you can use AI generated text and a free open source AI model and some surveying to do this combined project that has some really interesting results. And then when I release this deck, you can see this, but there's another open source model for voice cloning that is relatively easy to implement. And another project that we're doing right now is taking recordings of a bunch of different creative strategists in our office and then training this voice cloning technology on their voice and then creating soundboards. So I don't know if you guys have seen soundboards, but basically it's just like a board of clips of saying different things. So you can call someone and then you use the soundboard and play the different clips when you need to. So what we're planning on doing with this is creating these soundboards made from the cloned voice of our employees and then having them call their parents or their significant others or their friends and seeing if we can trick them into thinking that the cloned AI voice is actually the person. And then we'll do some data visualizations around the results. So I just thought that was a new cool one that we were working on that I don't think I've talked about on Traffic Think Tank, but again, it was really just going out and finding on papers with code. This is a new and emerging AI technology. It has an open source code base. You can use this to do your own thing with it. And there are the limitations on what can be done really are pretty limitless. And no one's really exploring how these tools could be used to tell interesting stories. So I just wanted to include this because somebody had asked it yesterday in the Traffic Think Tank Slack thread about quality and accuracy considerations. So like a lot of the things that I've talked about, you need to be really careful of how you're doing it and take a lot of care in the data acquisition piece of it, the data cleaning piece of it, and then the data analysis piece of it. So I wanted to give an overview of what our process is like at Fractal for handling these considerations, and maybe a rubric if you wanted to use to follow if you're thinking about building an internal content team that does this sort of data journalism. So just to start, success is really predicated on being authoritative and factually accurate. If you don't have that, you can't answer questions, and sometimes difficult questions from journalists that you're pitching to, you're not going to get a pickup. And the risks of these inaccuracies really can be pretty bad if you do something wrong, especially if it's on like a hot button topic, or if it's calling out a particular person or group of people or brand or organization. And there are risks both in data acquisition and cleaning, and then also analysis. So at Fractal, we use kind of a multi-staged fact check and QA process. And it begins with pre-planning. So our senior team members and managers will review our content strategists or our creative strategist project plan before they even get started to try and identify methodological issues that they might run into or data acquisition issues that they might run into. Once that's been approved, it goes into what we call the production card stage, which is where the creative does all of the work of data acquisition, sometimes in conjunction with some of our developers, sometimes not, and produces basically a rough draft that doesn't have any finished visuals on it. It just has like the raw data visualizations from Tableau or from Python or whatever else we've used. And that we use as the basis to do a peer review roundtable where we have multiple people in the room, including usually me, another senior creative, the account manager on that team, a promotions associate on the team, since we like to integrate the promotions team in the content creation process to make sure that they get to weigh in on what they think is newsworthy about the content that's being produced. And during that meeting, we're looking for data errors, interpretation errors, and providing feedback on the story quality and the hooks that will be used in the pitching process. And then the creative strategist goes back, takes that feedback under consideration, and iterates on their project. And they come back usually about a week later with a first draft for review. And that's a similar process to the production card review, but we're paying a little bit more attention to design detail and finish and copy. And then lastly, there's a final step. So we have an independent fact check and QA team that kind of goes over it one more time, looks for anything that might be questionable or risky, and then it's reviewed additionally to make sure that there wasn't anything wrong with the data analysis or there wasn't anything done with the data acquisition, and that everything that we put in there is factually correct, and QA is done to make sure there aren't any spelling grammar mistakes or anything with the data visualizations that need to be changed.
Kristen, a quick question on that one. Would you ever see a situation where you would look to work with maybe an external team if there was like a particularly like risky kind of topic you were focused on, to do like independent QA and kind of fact checking? Or do you feel that like the layers in the process are watertight enough to kind of get around that?
I would say that we're really careful during the ideation phase to try to not pick ideas that we think would take a level of expertise beyond our abilities, or some like master's or PhD level understanding of the topic area in order to properly do the project. So I think we can avoid having to include a lot of outside expert, um, asking them for help or whatever, just by doing that. But there have been quite a few cases where we've kind of gotten in the weeds with it, and we've had to include people that were domain experts on that topic or had done research using the data set that we're using. So like the fatal accident reporting system that I mentioned, which is one of the data sources that we've used extensively, we have consulted with the government that created that data set, when we've run into issues with the data. So there have actually been times where we've identified mistakes in the data itself, and talked to them about the reason for that mistake, what the answer to that mistake might be, and how we should go about parsing that particular part of the data set properly to make sure that we were representing it accurately.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. All right. And then lastly, I put a couple examples of the value of this work ultimately. So these are just, and you can look at Fractal's case studies, and these go in depth on exactly the reasons for these sorts of pretty large organic growth gains, but they're all really at the core predicated on the same thing: data driven content, essentially a journalistic approach paired with outreach and PR, and increasing appetite of journalists to write stories about data-driven content. And that's been the basis for Fractal's success and for our clients' success. And we think that, given the things that I outlined in the beginning of this talk, this trend is only going to continue and grow. And for brands, it's a huge opportunity, not only because there's a growing need, but because the resources and tools available are and the data available are growing exponentially. And so it's just a really exciting time. And that was it. That's my talk.
Thanks, Kristen. That was great. I have a couple of questions I'd love to run by you.
Sure.
So for a lot of people getting involved in their first foray into kind of any kind of big content campaign like this, and especially doing something with custom data and things like that, do you I think the perception from a lot of people is that, wow, this is going to be really expensive even if we do it ourselves. But I think a lot of the things you've outlined show how people can go and access freely available databases and with a bit of design work do this well. But my question comes more from, do you think there's still value in just doing like a one-off piece? Or do you think the it really is a drop in the ocean compared to if you're going to actually continuously push out content?
I mean, I think it depends on a couple of things, like the competitiveness of your industry and where you're starting from. So if you're starting from nowhere and you think that you can produce one great piece of content like this, and even if it does well, that it's going to massively move the needle in a competitive industry, it probably won't. It's more of a concerted effort over time and stacking up multiple wins, to be able to see the sort of growth that I showed in one of the last slides.
Hmm.
So although I think that's generally true, I've definitely seen cases where like a single huge win made an absolutely enormous impact. So probably the best example of that was a campaign we did called Phases of Meth for rehabs.com, maybe like 5 years ago. And it went absolutely insanely viral and built thousands of unique linking root domains. And that was the basis for taking the site from zero to like pretty decent visibility within a very competitive industry.
Hmm.
So like in the rare case, a single project could make a huge difference, but it would have to be something super viral, and it would have to be really very well related to what your topic area was, and getting a huge diversity of highly relevant anchor text links from high domain authority sites.
Right. So I guess that it really comes back to the same as like any way you would approach kind of content campaigns, whether they're like big link driven campaigns or whether it's kind of just a more general kind of content marketing campaign, I guess. Um, the the next question I have, which we also kind of had this question come through in the live Q&A as well, pertains more to surveys. And surveys are always something that I've certainly seen people get hung up on and either execute really incorrectly or miss out on opportunities when they're compiling surveys. So I guess my first I'll break this down to maybe a couple of small chunks. So the first question I would say is like, what are some of the best ways, maybe cost effective ways as well, of running surveys? Are there any platforms you particularly like, or do you tend to do really custom stuff most of the time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say we use Mechanical Turk the most just because it's the largest community and there are some good levers you can pull to restrict quality, like only using participants that have above certain scores or that have passed certain tests, things like that. But there still will always be some element that you need to work to filter out. So including good test questions within your survey is really important to make sure that people who are just, clicking bubbles instead of actually answering the questions, you can figure out who those people were and eliminate them. And then taking their mturk IDs and adding them to a blacklist so you don't see them in future surveys that you've done. So we have a lot of internal processes for making sure that when we run surveys, we're excluding low quality survey respondents and we're cleaning our data sets after the fact for people who didn't answer it well.
Mm,
Um, but then beyond that, we also have processes in place during the survey building, which are really important. So every survey that we create goes through a similar review process kind of to our content peer review process where each individual survey question and kind of the totality of all of the questions asked are looked at in terms of the different biases that you can introduce by asking questions in different ways and trying to make sure that we're using really methodologically sound ways of asking questions that won't introduce bias. And then also making sure we're asking questions that are going to yield the sorts of answers that we're looking for when we're creating those data visualizations and making sure that we're asking the right things to develop the story that we think is going to be most compelling and most newsworthy.
great. And so following on from that, when one of the other big things that I guess is always a big consideration when you're putting together surveys is around things like having a statistically significant sample size. And
Yeah.
um, I for I know that context matters a lot to the answer to the question I'm about to ask. So maybe I'll just frame it with, if you were going to be doing a nationwide US campaign, I know that like you can gain statistical significance technically on a really, really small group of people, right? I think it's in the hundreds for like
Mm-hmm.
the whole of the US. So what do you guys tend to have like a minimum bar that you would typically have for like a national US campaign to just almost get the trust of the journalists and people you're pitching into?
Yeah, so I would actually say about 1,000 respondents is what we typically do. And that's driven both by developing statistical significance, as you mentioned, but also based on feedback we've gotten from writers and editors at publications that they want to see sample sizes around that size in order to feel like it's an authoritative look. Um, but there are some surveys where we've done much smaller sample sizes. So for instance, when we're surveying like a really niche group of people that you wouldn't really be able to access on, say, like Mechanical Turk. So like certain professions, for instance. So we've done projects on like bartender confessions or police officer confessions, or opinions from specific groups like that, like lawyers. In those cases, using Facebook ads to do targeting has been a good way of doing that. But I would say in those cases, it was more of like a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach with maybe some elements of a quantitative analysis mixed into it. Um, but we also do things like weighting to make sure that we're representing populations correctly. Um, One thing that we can't really do typically so when we're doing demographic breakdowns or geolocation breakdowns, you can't really do it accurately, because when you start adding like multiple layers of demographic or location based breakdowns, the sample sizes that you have, even if you started with 1,000 or even 5,000 people, are not going to be large enough to have any sort of real significance. So that's something that we have to be really careful of, and it's one of the things that we check for in the methodological reviews that we do as we're creating the surveys, and then after we've created the surveys.
Okay, great. Final question, because we've had a couple through that came through on the Q&A. I just want to be conscious of your time as well, Kristen. So the question comes from Joe, and Joe mentions around where you'd called out in specifically like the Faces of Meth campaign, right? Besides campaigns like that are big viral hits, have you seen, I guess, strong correlations with some of these campaigns that are at least like big hits in terms of hitting like 100 linking root domains, that kind of level stuff, where it will really give site-wide rankings? Or is it typically more isolated around like the individual pages that you're actually promoting for? I know this is like very context specific, but how do you
Yeah,
tend to think about it?
certainly with a concerted effort over time, you'll see overall domain authority increase substantially from this sort of activity. You might see more value around, the specific pages, or not more value, but maybe more potential immediate rankings. But it's been the case, and I think our case studies show this, that across 3 projects, across 5 projects, across 10 projects over a period of 3, 6 months, a year, the accumulation of those high domain authority links results in domain authority improvements of the site itself, and that results in across the board rankings improvements. Now, of course, there are so many other factors that play into this: the quality of the content, how many keywords you're addressing with the content that you have, technical on-site SEO factors. But in general, it's an effect that we see time and time again across all of our clients. But we don't do one-off campaigns, and the reason we don't do one-off campaigns is because you likely won't see a huge immediate result from one campaign, even if it did relatively well. But you will over the course of 1, 2, 3 months and several campaigns. Of course, this totally depends on the competitiveness of the industry you're in, and in general, how many unique linking root domains and their quality or their domain authority that your competitors have. And that's, in our experience, has been a good proxy for estimating how many new, do follow high domain authority links you will need to acquire in order to be ranking competitively for your content that's similar to your competitors' content.